Welcome to all joining us today. My name is Adele Kroch and I'm from Food Focus. And I want to thank the Dairy Standard Agency for joining us to be a sponsor of yet another 10 webinars for 2023. The main purpose of the DSA is to promote the improvement of quality of milk and other dairy products in the interest of the consumer and the industry. One of their projects that the DSA has got is information and education. And with these webinars, they will be covering the entire dairy value chain. And today's topic is a good one to start with. So I want to say thank you to the Dairy Standard Agency for signing up for us for another year with very interesting topics and things to discuss. Today, we are going to speak about sharpen your pencil on dairy legislation. And the person that will be presenting the presentation to you is no one else than Jompie Burger. Jompie, like you said, there's actually no need for me to introduce you and to read your whole long CV because industry knows you very, very well. But Jompie, it's a pleasure for us having you. The people can read through your long CV, but we know that you've been in industry for years, and currently you're the managing director of the DSA, and we are so grateful to having you today. So we're really looking forward to hearing from you on this very interesting and, like you say, challenging topic at the moment in terms of what's going on with the legislation and with everything that the industry needs to know. So thank you so much, Jompie, for your time.
Thank you, Adele, and thank you to all that has been joining us last year and have been joining us or intend to join us this year. We are really looking forward to what the DSA is going to say and present to you. Because we are making use of different presenters from industry, and they are wonderful people, knowledgeable, good speakers, and I think they will also transfer a lot of very technical information to you. So, but thank you for this opportunity to speak to you again on this topic of sharpen your pencil. And why I picked this topic is because there are so many things going on. And I think to a degree, one tends to feel you are lost and things are out of control because of all the legislative matters that's ongoing. But, you know, we have to take a step back, and I want to refer to this slide that I've used in the past. And it's all about the regulator and who is being regulated. And I think to a large degree, if we don't cooperate and work together in the sense of better regulation, things can get really out of hand. And that is where the industry by itself plays a big role, because it makes perfect common sense. If industry does not behave, what would be the reaction of the regulator? Let's promulgate stricter regulation or even more regulation, and obviously that will result in this world of over-regulation. And that is clearly the opposite that we need in South Africa at this moment in time. And the reason why I say that, if you start over-regulating and complicating regulatory matters, we are not going to achieve what we want. And one of these aspects are to uplift our economy and our industry, and that also relates to the people that's in the food processing environment, in the agricultural sector. So the more we make legislation complicated, the more difficult it becomes, and then you start seeing the scenario of people living in two worlds. You will see the people sitting on the pavements, or traders, informal traders, and it becomes so difficult to make that step into the world of commercial competitiveness. In other words, they just stick to their own system and they don't participate in the regulatory environment, which is mainly intended to better food safety, to make things better and easier to comply with. But yes, and you will see, and I'll give you examples a bit later on, what is the impact if things go wrong in terms of cost. It takes a lot of money to make sure that we adhere to legislation. And the reason why I say that, one of the reasons, is that if legislation changes, and one good example there would be product compositional issues, one. The other one are labeling issues. If we change legislation, there's a ripple effect that's going through industry and the manufacturing of product, change of recipes, but also the labeling that becomes so expensive. And because there are millions and millions of rands being put towards these critical issues in marketing product. So I think let's just have a look at a bit what's happening in terms of the regulation and dairy product labeling issues that we deal with. And we have striking examples in South Africa where there's a lot of things going on. Power relationships taking place, diverging interests, and we'll get to that now because I think it's worthwhile mentioning. And then there's also these issues between government departments and dairy processors and distributors and food retailers that also have their own agenda and would like to see certain things happening in the right of legislation. So where do we strike the balance on this issue? Where is the place that we can say, good, this is good enough for the regulator, but it's also good for the consumer at the end of the day and the processors per se. So I think it's very important. And here's a good example. Let's go to the Agricultural Products Standards Act. Now, I know we've got quite an interesting group of people together, but when you just speak to this act, the Agricultural Products Standards Act, immediately you can see to provide for control over the sale and export. Export's very important of certain agricultural products. But now, what does this law cover? It covers product compositional issues, definitely, to make sure that at least the product complies with the local legislation, and then additionally, for export purposes, the export requirements. Now, just to give you a swing on this whole thing, the Act has got regulations, and here we obviously talk about the regulations relating to dairy and imitation dairy products. But the principle in the Act has been carried over into the regulation. Look at what is said in red there on the screen. You cannot present a product in a manner that conveys or creates or is likely to convey a false or misleading impression. The same counts for the Foodstuffs, Cosmetics and Disinfectants Act. So it's fundamental that we look at this as law enforcers, for example, or the industry, to make sure that we do not mislead the consumer in any way. Now, please look at the regulation that will follow as we carry on. The regulation reads the same as what it says in the Act, and that's very interesting, and it shows you how the industry views this, or the regulator. But nevertheless, the brand names, just look at these two pictures. You can see here on the left-hand side, I told you the role players, the powers, and what is happening. On the left, you can see a picture there of Clover Bliss. Now, this has, in the interim, it has changed. But what you see there is a container, and right at the bottom, it says yogurt-based dairy snack. Now, the example that I use here is that a product which was not really in existence in terms of the Agricultural Products Standards Act has managed to find its way onto the shelves. This is now already a few years ago. And what happened is this company decided to use a formula, reformulated the product by using dairy components on the principle of making yogurt, and then they changed the composition so that it becomes a yogurt-based dairy snack. Now, clearly there's a difference between a yogurt and a dairy snack. If you read the regulation correctly, you will find that there is no place on a label where you can use two class designations. In other words, yogurt is one thing and a dairy snack is another thing. The problem that came from that is that it definitely filled the market because there was quite a demand for this type of product, but the product compositional issues here, due to reformulation, changed the profile of the product. It is no longer a yogurt, but a dairy snack. But what do the consumer perceive? What does he buy when he takes this product off the shelf? And that is what happened. So it was okay in terms of regulation 260 to a degree to debate, and we made a difference. We had to change the regulation to say, but you can't have this product. In the interim, what happened is this product managed to establish itself on the shelf and in the eyes of consumer, and the retailers did not make life easier. So for many consumers, they went to the shelf and they saw this product as yogurt because of various reasons. And they bought this product, which is inferior to a degree in terms of product composition to yogurt. So the snack and the yogurt started to. And what is the net result of this is today the dairy snack market has grown to such an extent at the cost of yogurt that it is actually damaging to the industry. In other words, there's still people that buy dairy snack based on the label in front of them, based on the pictorial presentation in front of them, because some companies use their own yogurt labels and to market dairy snacks. So the consumers recognize the label as a product normally associated with integrity. They pick it up and off they go, but they don't know what they buy. Now that's a typical example that can result into the power play that's taking place between the industry and government structures and the lack of law enforcement. The other one that I want to show you on the right-hand side there is plant butter. Now, these products, there's no such product or provision in the law that makes provision for such a thing like a plant butter. So what happened is at some stage there was a consideration between the different governments to say, for one, under the APS Act, no, we don't regulate per se trademarks. So when a product has been gone through the registration of trademarks and it carries a name like plant butter, that's not our problem, that's the problem of the DTI. And the DTI said, no, it's not our problem. So what happened in the interim, there are many companies that abused this slight confusion in the industry. And today we have a plant butter product according to legislation that does not exist. It does not exist, but this product is still on the shelf. So there you can see, if you look at now, taking consideration butter, the word butter that only appears in the APS Act under dairy products, vegetable oils, sunflower. There's not a strain of dairy in this product. But what does the consumer perceive he's buying? He sees the word butter, the price is right, and he picks it up. So I just want to show you these things because it happens. It regularly happens. And the result of these things is that we have to engage with the law enforcement and the executive officer of the Department of Agriculture to say, do something. It's your constitutional assignment to act on these things so that we can get these things out of the market space until such time that it adheres to our local legislation. So what is the result of this is that there's a lot of engagement. Eventually the department started to act, and suddenly the company that manufactures this product acted in terms of Section 10, which deals with appeal issues, and then they were granted the right to appeal, and now that appeal is in process, which means that in terms of the Act, there should be an appeal board put together by the DG of the Department of Agriculture, and so forth it goes, and then in between, this product remains on the shelf, and it brings a lot of confusion in the eyes of the consumer. Again, what are we talking about? The influences that's taking place. And it's problematic. Here you have two products. The one says soy milk, the other one says rice milk, And again, if you go back to the compositional standards in terms of the APS Act, the regulations, yes, there is provision in the regulation to state that you may use the term milk when it is associated with a plant-based product, for example, soy or rice, milk for that matter, provided that you use the vegetable plant from which that milk is originating from, as it is presented on these labels. Now, again, this is very contentious if you take where we are in this world. We've got currently legislation that provides for this, and it's been going on for more than 30 years that you can do this thing. But suddenly there's a wake-up, a rude awakening that took place to say, but this is confusing. And where does it also come from? From the world of codex and the world of the World Health Organization, where there's conflictory matters that's addressing these issues. Now, it becomes very complicated because, and you will see we talk about that a bit later on, is that when you use the term milk, in terms of the general standards, the codex standards for the use of dairy terms, you are not permitted to use terminology such as milk. In other words, dairy terms. So are we in South Africa well aligned with what the general codex standards say? No, we're not. But I can see there's an approach from the World Health Organization to say no, they want to soften up on this matter. But nevertheless, remember that we are part of the World Trade Organization. We have the SABS standards, for example. We are linked to ISO, we're linked to Codex, and we must be careful not that we step into a world where we start causing technical trade barriers. These things can also be very misleading to the consumer, and we have to be very careful when we design our legislation and revisit them, review that we are doing the right thing. So I'm taking you through the world of what's happening, and I'm still on the Agricultural Product Standards Act, and I'm playing it off against this pressure that comes from a push and pull, and everybody wants to have the best for themselves. Look what happened since 2016. The Minister of Agriculture said that it's okay, it's written into legislation that the minister can appoint assignees. The assignees will then fulfill the work of inspection services as per the Act. And so it happened. There were advertisements that gone out, and in 16-17 we saw the appointment of various assignees in different food categories. But the processes that were followed was not correct. It was not correct. So it resulted into court cases, serious court cases that carried on from 2017 until 2021, 2022. And what happened here is we saw that the Directorate Inspection Services of the Department of Agriculture had to stand back in a way so that the appointment of the assignees could fulfill the role of the inspection services. As that whole thing boomeranged, it resulted in virtually no inspection services in the dairy industry, and also so much for other food sectors, agricultural food sectors. So it cost us a lot of money. We ended up in the High Court, and the result was that the Major Mogul, who was the appointed assignee, went into business rescue, and that was basically the end of that because there were too many things that was wrong. So the end result was a dysfunctional assignee, and to a degree a dysfunctional Directorate Inspection Services when it came to enforcement of the law in terms of the APS Act. These things are critical things. And it happens because when there's no transparency and good consideration and good governance being given to the detail of these issues. Along with that, we say as the dairy industry, please, we want to have proper law enforcement. That is what we owe the industry as well, to make sure that we comply. Nevertheless, we had to take this thing to court, and the case was settled, and the Minister of Justice had to approve that, and we were paid back for the the costs involved, which exceeded 1 million rand in any case. So these are damages that the industry don't always recognize, that because of those powers and diverse interests that's taking place. Now, talking about legislation, for all of you people, take note of this. The Border Management Authority Act has been published some time ago, and it's now been put through Parliament, and it's been to such an extent. What is the function of the Border Management Act? That there should be proper control at borders. That relates to food products, and there's a lot of competencies that work together to fulfill the role of the Border Management Authority Act. Now, we, in short, talk about the BMA. Now, there you can see what is considered to be important is exercised by multiple organs of state with the purpose of securing the borders of the Republic. Yes, it's got to do with food safety. It has to do with the dairy product compositional standards. It has to do with a lot of legislation. It has to do with the importation of foodstuffs into our country. But in the process, when you look at this, the whole development to protect our borders, what is happening in our national level inside our country? So the competencies that's important for putting this Border Management Authority Act together and functional at the cost of approximately 3.3 billion rand over a period of time. Some of the competencies that falls under the normal activities, say for instance the Directorate Inspection Services, those people are seconded to this Border Management Authority. And what happens now is you're creating a bit of a weak spot in terms of the inspection services that need to take place in our country at national level, provincial level, municipalities. So it is a concern, and it makes the world quite complicated if you think how long it's going to take us to make sure that we've got proper law enforcement. So complexities in reviewing the dairy and imitation dairy compositional regulations. Those of you that's interested, taking note of Regulation 1510 that deals and which is in the process of review. There are lots of things happening. I think it's very important that in our world that we have to consult very widely. There are other stakeholders involved, the Codex General Standards for the use of dairy terms, what is being said by the WTO, and what opposing statements are currently taking place between the FAO and the GSUDT Codex. So those are wide aspects that's not generally considered when we just open a discussion on the tops of things. The Agricultural Product Standards Amendment Bill. I'm not sure who of you have been paying attention to this, but we have the Agricultural Product Standards Act, and here's the amendment bill. What's the purpose of this amendment bill? It's to make provision for specific definitions, and now very important to provide for auditing of product for management control systems. That word management of controls, management control systems relate to your quality, your food safety management systems to a degree, and whatever may fall under the APS Act. So it makes provision for the setting of tariffs, and here you see the word by assignees on a cost recovery basis. In other words, it must be done in a non-profit manner. It can't be something that is conducted by appointed assignees by the minister by a means of profiteering or money-making schemes. Make further provision for the minister to make regulations. Now, this is important because, ladies and gentlemen, out there is the world of organic products, free range. And these are the things that hampered the Directorate Inspection Services in the past, because the law, as it was, do not make provision for the inspectorate to go out and audit management control systems, and even do physical audits to verify whether, when a claim is made, that such product is on the right side of the fence in terms of legislation. So this is a good thing that is happening. It will also help to order the appointment of assignees and also start regulating them in a proper manner in terms of their execution of their job. However, if you are interested in this, you can always contact me, but there's a specific request out for industry to comment on this standards amendment bill before it's going to be promulgated. That's just for your interest. Now, the regulatory environment in the dairy industry, already you can see how fragmented this world is. And as an industry, for you that's listening to me today, it goes from animal feed, and specifically in the world of the environmental health. Animal health, the environment, milk parlors, transportation, product composition, food safety, processing plants, storage and distribution. Now, in terms of the regulations that's governing the activities of the EHP, most of these things are addressed. It's right through the value chain. So we've got to take serious cognizance of all this that has to be done. What we see from time to time is the risk that follows. The regulations are issued in terms of different laws, and the enforcement of these laws lies within different structures of the departments. If we don't talk to each other, there's a Department of Health, and you can see the various acts. And if there's no proper discussion taking place, intergovernmental, governmental or intragovernmental, we are start seeing serious problems. And that's to a large degree why this Intergovernmental Relations Framework Act was published already in 2005, to make sure that the Department of Agriculture and Health, and DTI, all these people talk to each other in terms of what is of the best interest in the publication of legislation. This is very important. And I'll tell you why. If we don't talk as industry and government together on these issues, we are going to see more and more problems occurring. In terms of the publication, the Foodstuffs Act, the regulation, the draft, 2986 of 31 January 2023, we saw the paper publication. And this thing was really long awaited. And we soon discovered that this regulation that was published was the wrong one. It was published on 31 January 2023. And if I say the wrong one, it was the previous draft of this document that was published, not the final one. So where does it leave the industry and all stakeholders? We have to now take note of the fact of the publication and that the closing date for comments on this draft 3 months later, which means end of April. And what are we going to do? Because you as a member of the public, industry, or as a regulator does not know what is the correct version of this document and the content thereof. So we can speculate to say, but yes, most of these things are in any case, it's just a few things that have to change. But from a technical point of view, you are in a position where the state is now requesting from you, the Minister of Health, to report on something and comment on something that is completely incomplete. Now, I don't think that is fair. I don't think it's good governance. We've been in contact with the minister and the DG and requesting, please keep us informed. Please repeal this or withdraw this draft so that you can republish the new one. And the time has gone by. I still have good faith that we will still see the correct version being published together with a revision of the date for comment. So the date for comment should also shift along with the publication of the new draft. Cannot be the same date. So that I cannot give to you on paper, but I think you should be aware of it when you look at that draft. Do not assume that this is the correct document. There are being sessions being offered out there to the industry, and it's a good thing because it sensitizes you to this document, but don't make the fault or the mistake to assume that this is the final one. If I say understand the laws governing your value chain, as a stakeholder in the industry, this is so critical, ladies and gentlemen. I want to assure you, if you look to the far left, There are things happening at farm level, at crop production and feed production that you cannot change in final product. And those laws and regulations are there, whether they fall under Act 101 or Act 36 for animals, for plant residues, and so forth, chemical residues, and it's also covered under the Foodstuffs, Cosmetics and Disinfectants Act when it comes to the regulation. And that is where it's so important. You cannot just pay attention to the final product. You should understand the principles, the leading principles of what has to be done to make sure that your final product is safe. You won't find antibiotics in a product as a result of milk processing. No, it will come from milk during milk production, animal health and welfare. But pesticides residue is the same. Why would you find it happening in the secondary industry? It comes from the farm if it's not well regulated. So it's a whole chain, value chain thing that we all have to pay attention to. These leading principles towards legal compliance and beyond is so critical because we have to understand if we talk about the micro specifications, let's say on milk and dairy products, that these products are not the same. Each one from a risk-based approach is different. It's got its own unique value chain, and bear in mind that you cannot compare a hard cheese to a soft cheese. A very simple example. The one is far more perishable, likelihood is far greater to be the carrier of pathogenic organisms like Listeria and so forth. So be aware of it, that when you use the terminology of milk and dairy products, there are various risk-based approaches that you need to follow and look out for the risk analysis on these products. What we also discover is the issue about effective communication. Now, whether it's internal in your organization or between the stakeholders, for example, the farmers that's farming the milk crop production, the milk producers, and the secondary industry. There must be effective communication between what the law prescribes are the minimum standards towards public safety, product composition, and so forth. If we miss this communication line, we are in serious trouble because we expect certain people to know things which is not necessarily the truth because we obviously all work in silos. Another interesting one is what is our level of food safety and quality skills? Absolute prerequisite in terms of legislation. There must be training, whether it's from the regulator side or the regulated. So we strongly advocate that there should be money spent on properly training our people, not only on the production side of things, but have good insight and understanding in terms of what is required to make sure that we comply with the legislation. Reliable suppliers should also be held accountable for the product that they produce that could have a negative impact on the final product. And that is where the effective communication continue. What kind of work do we know and how much do we know about the principles of hazard, for example, when we talk about targeted hazard control? So what we require here is knowledge about these subjects, about what is a risk and what is not a risk. Is it a minor risk? Is it a major risk? And for that proper risk analysis, we will talk quickly about that. Then there's the shared responsibilities. Obviously, we are all in this value chain, and we have to understand what the law is required for us before we enter into production and processing. Before we start into feed manufacturing, we can't find out in hindsight what is required from us because some companies do operate like that. They see a marketing ploy that will work for them, they put products together and they run with it without taking knowledge of what is required. What is the acceptance criteria for you in terms of legal standards? And this acceptance criteria should feature into your processing production lines. And that is where the environmental health practitioner has to have insight into this, have to have understanding about what is the minimum legal requirements or are before you go. Does the laboratories understand when they test a product? Can they interpret the results when they test? to make sure that you're in or outside specification how to act. Then there's the performance of the control measures. How do we test our product? What does the law require in terms of testing to know so that your samples are representative at the end of the day, to make sure you get a good sample representation and test results that carry some integrity. The cooperation between the organizations, I think it's really time that one has to go and say, who are these stakeholders as it plays into my world? And do they know what they're doing? Do they know what I am doing, so that we can have this flow of information? And then lastly, the role of the competent authorities. Know your regulatory bodies. One example, the other thing is we really expect our regulators to understand their own law, so that we don't have this problem of confusion and making effective communication a serious problem. And that is why you have external bodies like the DSA. We request industry to make an effort to participate so that we can talk and move forward. So understanding the principles of this risk analysis and legal compliance, I think it's very important to understand the processes which consist of risk assessment, risk management, and risk communication. It's all about control your risks, manage your risks, and talk about your risks so everybody can know where we are. Very important in that respect, and here's a picture to that effect. So we can see risk communication really involves everybody in this dairy value chain. So from a risk assessment point of view, surely we look at identification, evaluation, what systems are in place, and then the risk management. What control do we execute by means of works instructions, procedural documents, policies, and so forth. These are things that help us to better our world in terms of food safety and quality. So talking about risk analysis, it's at the heart of the modern approaches. We see that in all legislation. In our South African legislation, we can see that it's already been carried through, and it's a philosophical approach that has been adopted some time ago. Very important. We cannot design legislation in South Africa with our consulting the ISO, for example, the Codex, the FAO, WHO, and what the national governments say with regards to risk analysis. If we don't do that, we get in a situation where we fall out of touch with what is happening and what is necessary to know. So the competent authorities in South Africa are obliged by international agreements, so important, to similarly utilize risk assessment wherever possible and practical, so that we can cover the issue of where are the risks in terms of the various kinds of food. And as I said in the beginning, this is also applicable for the different products in the dairy value chain. So let's talk about that. Prerequisites for effective risk assessment in the dairy industry. Let us ask ourselves, what can go wrong? How likely is it to go wrong? How serious will it be if it went wrong? And what can be done to reduce the likelihood? So the principles of identification, the evaluation step, how serious it will be, and what can we do to fix it? The control measure is covered in this whole thing. I'm going to skip the slide. It's just more a technical approach to this whole thing. I've discussed this, and when we talk about the risk management, remember we've got the risk management, which is at the end of the day, the mechanism that must make the difference. In other words, to make sure that we control our problems. Identification and weighing of control measures, very important. If we say that we, for example, to comply with legislation, changing our standard operating procedures, whatever, we have to go and measure if that trick of ours is working. If it's not working, we've got to go through an absolute rational process. And that's where you have the food safety teams, or teams of people working together through this process of risk analysis to identify, remember it's rational, look at the various types of methods that we can use to implement control measures. There are more than one alternative in most cases. Then to go through the process to identify the one that will most likely give you the best performance. And then we have to measure again to see, do we get the desired outcome or not. If these things do not feature in your world of food safety, product composition, control, compliance, we are in trouble, because those are the fundamental issues to comply with the law. Here you can see forbids the sale of foodstuff that may be detrimental to human health. All that we said prior to this is to ensure that you comply with the Foodstuffs, Cosmetics and Disinfectants Act, for example. Okay, then there's the rest, as we have discussed, about misleading claims and other related matters. So, ladies and gentlemen, our world is changing. It's changing fast. We look at a lot of new technology, product development, and so, and it really makes it difficult. It is not easy to write effective regulation, because the regulator and the regulated must have a clear understanding of the business and technology that is to be regulated. It's easy to write a law when you ignore what is happening in the world outside, because a legislation, you don't change this month and next month again. You write it for a period of time before you intervene, unless it requires a serious intervention. And this applies to dairy very much, because what we see is an interesting change in dairy technology. Simply that when you look at milk and milk products, you have to understand the constitution of a dairy product or a milk, the constitutes that's being used, that can be used in various other products. For example, the amount, let's use an example. We're on the liquor side of things now, Amarula. It's so important to understand that even in the world of liquor and the exportation of liquor, that there must be a good understanding that's taking place in our world so that you can effectively regulate it. Currently, this bad situation has developed that in Europe, and I'm talking about the EU and the UK, for example, now, you cannot export even compositional products like biscuits that contain dairy constituents. Why? Because it does not comply with the requirements of the EU for exportation. And the question here is, why not? And I'll talk to you about that, because it's how the systems work, about the composition and export. We talked about this, and ladies and gentlemen, please bear with us. This draft is going to take a while. I think we are really focusing, and we've got specialists on the job. I just want to touch on this thing again. If you look at what is required in terms of the draft, one thing that is really standing out for us is the front of pack nutritional labeling. Front of pack labeling, we often use the terminology of that, but it's nutrition labeling. So what you see here, the government is really pushing into this world of healthy options. So putting warning signs on food product to say, hey, consumer, when you pick up this product, look for these warning signs. And if you see this, please note that this product is high in sugar, or it's high in fat, or in salt. But how the formulations work is of great concern, because it works together with the sugar-based the taxes on sugar levies. Is that you see sugar, but there's a huge differentiation of sugar in a product when you talk about the intrinsic sugar, for example, lactose in dairy versus the added sugar. So when you drink milk, surely you drink sugar, but that is lactose that you can subdivide into other two sugars, but it's intrinsic part of the product. It's a God-given thing. So when you have fat in the product, like milk fat, cream, that is a part of the product in the, and when you start writing standards and you want to tell the consumer, listen, this product is bad for your health, you have to identify products that are really not good for your health. products high in white sugar, for example, for high levels, in industrial fats, for example, and very high in salt content. So if there's no distinguishing between these products, you will find that some dairy products will end up in the basket together with sugar-based beverages. And we ask the Department of Health, please reconsider when you start talking about fruit juice with intrinsic sugar and dairy products, for example, because there's a huge difference between these products, for example, and other products that's made up with other constituents high in processed ingredients. So I'm going to just be short on this, just to make sure that you understand. Sometimes people will say, we've got a problem, you have to change the legislation. And I've noted in most cases, unless it's a very, very urgent matter, there is a step-by-step approach that needs to be followed by all of us. We create this world of awareness towards there's a problem, we identify the problem, and we need to deal with this problem. So we go through the stages of storming, forming, and norming about our legislation. That's a normal phenomenon. So there's consultation processes taking place. We consult with government structures. We take consulting sessions, processes one after the other one with government, and we also look at what's happening of the World Trade Organization, so that we don't create technical trade barriers. I'm not going to go into the detail of that, but also look at what's happening here. People perhaps sometimes don't realize the role of the SABS. The SABS is our standardizing body. Okay, they write the standards. They are the standards writer, for example. They are connected to the International Standards Organization, which is part of the World Trade Organization. And it says here, the standardizing body shall ensure that standards are not prepared, adopted, or applied with a view to or with the effect of creating unnecessary obstacles to international trade. So where international standards exist in the world, then, or their completion is imminent, the standardizing body shall use them. Here it says, so if there's already a standard, you have to use it, or the relevant parts of it, as a basis for the standard to develop, except where there's specific criteria or conditions involved. Now, this spells out the world that the SABS cannot simply go and write standards. It has to consult, it has to consider what our national government says about various type of regulations. We can easily say, but yes, the standards are simply guidelines, but remember, it directly influences the way that we conduct our business in terms of writing technical regulations or standards. So it carries on, and then eventually when we get to the point now that everybody is in agreement, there will be a final document that is submitted to the minister for approval once it's also gone through parliament. But there's another step that we don't always pay attention to, and this is what happened with the labeling regulation now. There was a long delay from 2010. We saw 429. We saw the revision of 429 carrying on. And when we thought we were ready to have this document now in a position of see you soon, there was a lot of engagement with the Department of Monitoring and Evaluation. We talk about the DME to finalize what is called the SEAS, Socio-Economic Impact Assessment. So in South Africa, the Cabinet decided on the need for a consistent assessment of socio-economic impact of policy initiatives, legislation, regulatory matters. So the approval followed a study commissioned by the Presidency and the National Treasury. This is all established. And what this whole thing spells out for us is you cannot just publish legislation. You have to go through a process where there's consultation to see if this newly published legislation is going to have serious socio-economical impacts for the citizens of this country, for example. And that is where our document, or not our document, the draft regulation has spent a lot of time to sort out some disputes, and it has gone further. Where's that regulation, that draft now? The right one. It's with the minister to be signed, and hopefully it will be signed soon so that we can see the product that we can comment on further. So the role of the Codex Alimentarius, very important, ladies and gentlemen. In many cases, as soon as we refer in health legislation, for example, the South African legislation relating to miscellaneous additives in food, we fall back to a large degree on the Codex Alimentarius for the general standards for food additives. It plays a huge role in our dairy industry. There are many Codex standards that's adopted into our legislation, so that we make sure that we are aligned with what's happening in the world. And the same counts for taking consideration of WTA, our Codex. And then there's an organization called the International Dairy Federation. This International Federation, the IDF, works together with Codex, and they will give their input to Codex as much as South Africa as a South African Codex contact point that will liaise with the African Codex contact point that will convey their views on new Codex standards at the meetings that take place normally in Europe. So it tells you how this world is being put together. Locally in South Africa, we've got the role of Milk SA to make sure we participate in this world in drafting legislation. We have a team of experts that are constantly working on reviewing and commenting on the matters. For you that has been involved in the process of Regulation 1555 and the review, we've made good progress to a point, and then other legislation got a preference to the 1555, but surely we hope to pick up the pace again so that we can also review these regulations relating to milk and dairy products, especially with regards to the standards for antimicrobial issues. Very important for you that want to export, ladies and gentlemen, this is not easy to say that you want to export. There's a whole process, and it's governed by the Department of Agriculture. Now, of late, we've been exporting a lot of product within the SADC countries, but also to the BNL, Botswana, Eswatini, Lesotho, and Namibia. That has been ongoing. But now of late the situation is as such. The EU, in terms of the European EPA agreement, it works that way, that there's agreements established between us and Europe, the EPA agreement, so that they import into South Africa, but we can also export to the EU. Now, as much as we can export to SADC and the BNL countries, we cannot export to the EU because we've got no national chemical residue monitoring program in place. On top of the national residue monitoring program, we also have to have an EU control program that goes a bit beyond of how we control residues in the country. Without this, we will never be in a position to export to the EU. There's no chance. So there's a lot of things that must happen now at the Department of Agriculture in conjunction, collaboration with the private sector to make sure that we put all measures in place to make sure that we can export again to the EU, for which we have. There's an example. We talk about the veterinary procedural notices. This one is specifically referring, for example, the registration of establishment for export, and the EHP has got a huge role to play here because most of the legislation that is quoted in this VPN 20 for export relates to the world of Regulation 961 on parlors and secondary facilities for the approval, and Regulation 368. I'm near the end, ladies and gentlemen. We have to take also cognizance of the fact that we've got GI regulations regulations relating to the protection of geographical indications. Those GIs relate to products that are unique to South Africa. As much as you've got GIs for Europe, let's say champagne, for example, you've got many cheeses that is controlled by GIs. We in the dairy industry currently do not have one, but the regulation has been published, and in future, if we should develop a product that needs protection in terms of geographical indications for dairy, we will have one. You'll find it quite interesting that on the shelves you will now buy feta, which is called South African feta. Now, this is a result of the EU requirements in terms of protecting their geographical indications, because feta is in the EU originating from Greece, and it's a Greece GI. So now we can use, by agreement, we can use the term feta, but we can't say just feta. Otherwise, it implies that it is a Greek feta. It has to say South African feta for that example. So there's a lot of compliance in respect of that, but there's also non-compliance. This is about health promotion levies. For those of you that are interested in this matter, you must have heard that the levies would have been revised by 1 April 2023, but now there will be no increase on the levy of sugar tax for 2023, 4 and 5 years to come. Ladies and gentlemen, our world is opening up. In South Africa, we are also working with the African Organization for Standardization. That is called ARSU. They are also linked to the World Health Organization, to ISO, and there is a huge request currently and the process that's going on with the harmonization of standards, ISO standards, ARSO standards for Africa, to such a degree that there are 75 different standards for dairy products identified in Africa that needs harmonization to better trade, harmonized trade on the continent. We are part and parcel of that makeup, and we contribute to make sure that we deal with the technical committee on milk and milk products, so that we give our inputs in terms of what's happening in South Africa. I've tried to give you really a broad view of what's going on without too much technical in-depth issues on specific regulations. I hope this have made sense. I really hope that you've got some questions in this respect, and there are, please. Thank you so much.
Well, Yompi, I think you must put your camera on, because we need to see one another eye to eye, and so that the audience can also see you. Wonderful. Yo, that was a mouthful, and you know, by listening to you, I've just realized the importance of what you are doing with these webinars, and for us networking and providing information through to industry. Because from your presentation, I can see there's so much that's happening, but in that what is happening, there's still uncertainty of when is it happening, how is it going to happen, what's the impact going to be. And one of the questions that I got from the audience is, someone said to me, asked the question of what is the difference between an act, a regulation, a standard, and a voluntary guideline or a voluntary standard. So I don't know if you just in summary want to explain that component. I will add to it, but I think that just shows in terms of the audience of all of these things that you were saying. What must I, as a person that's making something, what must I actually do? And where can I make sure that I constantly are listening or belonging to an association or something to make sure that I will be updated with this information? So just that question at first, Yompi, what is the difference between an act, a regulation, a voluntary standard, a guideline? If you can just explain that in short. I can't hear you, Yompi. I think you've muted yourself.
So yes, the order that you mentioned there, that is correct. So let's start with the act. The act in principle is the overarching governing policy rule that is being published to address a specific issue, and that would normally allow the minister to execute or make provision for different functionalities within the Act. As you will see with the Foodstuffs Act and the Agricultural Product Standards Act, that is the act that governs in principle, but it does not specify the detail of how we should execute. It puts down the policy or the regulatory rule that must happen by the minister. And for example, you will see in many acts that there's provision in the act itself that the minister may publish regulations. That's normally how it works. So you will never find a piece of legislation that can supersede the act per se. So the act is the highest form of regulation, if I can say that, because it spells out the umbrella under which everything must happen. Then, as the minister then say he can publish or she can publish regulations, the regulation will take you deeper into the how, the what, and the why.
Yes.
So it's very much like a policy, and the procedure will tell you what to do.
Yeah, and it's also the acts and the regulations, you don't have a choice. You need to comply with those.
You can't, it's not negotiable. So in other words, the overarching position of the act by itself, you cannot interfere in that process. It's only the minister that can review the process and revisit through public participation the content of the act. So let's say it's on its highest form, and that's the intent of to make provision for the publication of a regulation. So then when you get to the regulation itself, whether it's in terms of a specific element, regulations relating to milking parlours, it will deal with a specific issue of regulation, of that regulation. Or when you talk about Regulation 638, it will deal specifically on what are the hygiene requirements that you need to place. Those things you can't put in the act because there's too many regulations. So the regulations provide for that. So you have the statement, the intent, or what is going to happen by means of the law, the act, and under that you will find all these, under the Foodstuffs Act, specifically, I think there are close to 48 different regulations that's governing food additives, preservatives, colorants, law enforcement. Yeah, so that gives you the regulation. Now, that is also not negotiable because you will have to adhere to the regulation.
Yes.
It doesn't matter if your local municipality has published a municipal bylaw. Even that bylaw cannot supersede what the regulation says because the regulation is subject to the act. So now you have this world of regulatory. Where does the standards fit in? These standards are voluntary standards that's being published by the industry in conjunction with standardization bodies such as the SABS. So often it's required that there are specific test methods developed or criteria when you are really drilling down in specific criteria. There could be standards like, let's talk about the SABS or the South African National Standard 10049, for example. It teaches you about hygiene requirements, but we must remember, when you talk about Regulation 638, it's a very generic regulation. It gives you basic, it spells you out the guidelines, which is now enforceable, of what a food sector must comply with. Whether you're a butcher or a dairy manufacturer or a restaurant or even a food vendor for that matter. But when it goes down into the specifics, these standards that are written towards these matters are always supportive. It cannot be considered something which will supersede the regulation. It's complementary. So you cannot go by a standard and call it a regulation unless that specific regulation is quoted. The standard is quoted in the regulation.
Yes,
then it takes over, it gets the standard, obtains a standard as part of a regulation, and then it's a mandatory enforceable document.
Yes.
I hope that makes sense. Now, the guidelines that you will find, that is also now again something, if not written into law as a guide, as an annexure or attachment to a regulation, it's merely a guide. That guide will normally summarize legislation as a standard would, from which it gets its information or industry standards. So from a legal point of view, it may not carry any legal status, but it gives you industry information on how you should conduct the business, or whatever the case may be, or interpret for that matter.
Yes, yeah. And I think the point or everything that you've mentioned now makes the point for me clear that as a manufacturer, it is your role and your responsibility to make sure that you comply with all laws, regulations, guidelines. Now, what happens is, as a manufacturer, sometimes when you want to supply to a retailer
Yes.
has got certain things that they request you to comply with. So you need to make sure, firstly, what the law is that you need to comply with, and then under that law, what the regulations. Now, I know, Yompi, on your dairy standard.co.za website, you've
Yes.
got that one section there that says legislation, and you have gone and you've broken down all the different departments, indicating what acts are applicable under those departments and applied by those departments. You've got the regulations, you've got the guidelines, you've got the codex and everything. So to the audience, definitely go to the dairystandard.co.za website, and at the top where it says legislation, it really gives you a nice guideline in terms of what is out there and what you should look at. And then obviously today's webinar will be, it's been recorded and it will be available. You will also see on the Dairy Standard website, they've got a tab that says webinars. So all the webinars that we've been hosting with the DSA since 2021 is available on that website as well. From our side, we communicate through our newsletter, so please make sure that you sign in on the Food Focus newsletter to ensure that you can get it monthly. And Yompi, the other questions that I had one other question. It seems like the way that you presented, you answered most of the questions as we were going through, so that is good. So I just see there's another question that came in here. Given the draft regulations for food labeling, do we foresee other food cosmetic disinfectant regulations being amended, sweeteners and colorants? Do you have any insight into that?
There's a likelihood, Adele, that there might be changes taking place. We know there are documents awaited to be changed. For example, Regulation 155 under the Foodstuffs Act. But it's not going to happen quick. If I look at the pace, how long it takes to change regulation currently, it's still going to be a while. And please take note, nothing will happen prior to proper consultation with the industry and all its stakeholders. So everyone will know. And please, I plead with you people, if there's a regulation out there that's applicable to you, please comment on it. Make your contribution. So it makes a difference, because you are all part and parcel of the dairy and the food value chain. So make a difference, you and your colleagues, read through the information and comment possibly where it's possible. Thank you.
Definitely. Yompi, thank you so much for your time. We are 12 minutes over our time, but I just want to say thank you to the audience for taking your time to participate in this webinar. And please look at our websites, our Dairy Standard website.co.za, as well as foodfocus.co.za. Make sure that you signed up for the newsletter. Like I said, this recording will be posted on our website, and there will also be a PDF of the approved slides that you will be able to download. We will be mentioning the new webinar for May in our newsletters going out in April, so please have a look out to that. But Yompi, to you and your team, thank you so much for the information.
Pleasure.
Thank you for being another platform where we can interact. And yes, audience, it's important for you to network with us. After this presentation, after the webinar ends, there's a short survey. I ask you, please answer the questions on the survey, because this information then we will utilize to make sure that we put a program together for the rest of the year, and that we focus to answer you on the different types of questions that you've got. So to everybody, thank you so much. Have a great day. Until next time.